We continue now at the top of Daf Dalet Amud Beis in Meseches Horayos. This is Horayos Daf 4b. On the previous Amud, the Gemara said that if the Sanhedrin were to issue a mistaken ruling and deny an entire concept in the Torah, like the entire concept of Shabbos, that would not be included as a mistaken ruling in terms of the halacha of bringing a par helam davar shel tzibor. Let's say the entire community or the majority of the community would follow that mistaken ruling. And so the Gemara now continues and asks, Boy Rav Yosef asks the following question. Ein charisha b'Shabbos mahu. What if the mistaken ruling that the Sanhedrin issues is that there's no halacha that you're not allowed to plow on Shabbos? Mi amrinan, do we say, Kevan de kamodu bekulhu milsa, since they admit to the concept of Shabbos, kibitul mixas v'kiyam mixas dami, that would be the same as nullifying part but accepting part, meaning that would be considered a ruling, a mistaken ruling in part of Hilchas Shabbos, and therefore it would be included in the halacha of par helam davar shel tzibor. O dilmor, maybe, Kevan de ka akron lecharisha kol ikar, since they're completely uprooting the idea of plowing being asur on Shabbos, kakiras guf dami, that would be like uprooting the entire Shabbos. And the Gemara says, Tashma, come and hear a proof from the Mishnah. The Mishnah said, Yesh nida b'Torah, aval habal shomeres yom keneged yom pater. The Mishnah gave an example of a situation where you're not uprooting the entire mitzvah. The Sanhedrin understands that there's a concept of nida, but they have a mistaken ruling and say that having relations with a shomeres yom keneged yom is pater. Now va'amai, now why would that not be considered uprooting the whole thing? Ha'karyan l'shomeres yom keneged yom kolikar, aren't they totally uprooting shomeres yom keneged yom? And so you see that's not considered uprooting the whole thing. But the Gemara says it's not necessarily a proof. Amar lach Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef will say to you, shomeres yom deka amrin kiddushonin. Shomeres yom that we're talking about is the shomeres yom that we mentioned on the previous summit. The Gemara had already answered on the previous summit that we're not talking about the whole idea of shomeres yom, just a certain detail. And the Gemara continues, Tashma, come and hear the following proof from our Mishnah. Yesh Shabbos b'Torah, if the Sanhedrin says there is a concept of Shabbos in the Torah. Aval hamotzi merishas hayachal rishas rabin pater, but somebody who transfers something from the private domain to the public domain is exempt. That's the mistaken ruling. And so again, va'amai, so why should that be considered just part of the mitzvah? Ha'akariyan lahotzah kolikar, aren't they completely uprooting the whole concept of hotzah, of taking from one rishus to another? And the Gemara again says, Hasam nami kiddushan, and there also, we answered on the previous summit that we're just talking about a particular detail of Hotzah, again, as we said on the previous summit. And the Gemara continues, Tashma, come and hear the following proof from the Mishnah. Yesh avodas kochavim b'Torah, aval hamishtachah v'pater. If the Sanhedrin says there is avodah zarah in the Torah, but one who bows to avodah zarah is exempt, again, v'amai, why should that be just part of the mitzvah of ha'akariyan l'shtachavaya kolikar? Aren't they completely uprooting the idea of bowing? And the Gemara again answers, Amri, they said, hishtachavaya nami kiddushan, and by bowing as well, we said on the previous summit, we're talking about a particular detail in terms of bowing. And the Gemara continues, Boy Rabbi Zeir. Rabbi Zeir asks the following question. Ein Shabbos b'Shviyas ma. What if the mistaken ruling is that there's no Shabbos, you don't have to keep Shabbos during Shviyas, during the Shemitah year. So b'maito, what mistake is being made in that ruling? B'hadin kra, the mistake is being made in the interpretation of the following pasuk. The pasuk says, B'chorish uvakotzer tishbos. It says you're going to rest from plowing and harvesting. The full pasuk is Sheshas Yomim Tavod, you're going to work for 6 days. Uvayom hashvi tishbos b'chorish uvakotzer tishbos. It says that the 7th day you're going to rest from plowing and harvesting. And so they made a mistake as follows. Bizman di iko charish, at a time that there is plowing, meaning not in a Shemitah year, so iko Shabbos, then there's the laws of Shabbos. Uvizman de leka charisha, but if it's a time where there's no plowing, leka Shabbos, then they mistakenly say there is no Shabbos. So what if that would be the mistaken ruling of the Sanhedrin? Mi amrinan, do we say, kevan de mekaimin lo b'shar shnei shavua, since they're fulfilling Shabbos in the other years of the Shemitah cycle, kevitel mixas v'kiyam mixas dami, that's just like denying part of the mitzvah of Shabbos. Oh, Dilmor maybe, kevan de ka'akariyon lei b'shviyas, since they're completely uprooting Shabbos in the Shemitah year, ka'akiras haguf dami, that would be like uprooting the entire Shabbos, in which case it would not be included as a mistaken ruling in terms of the halachos of par helam davar shel tzibor. And the Gemara continues, Amar Ravina says, Tashma, come and hear a proof from the following Brisa. The Brisa says, Novi shenisnabe lakor dover mi divrei Torah chayev. If a prophet, he prophesizes to completely uproot something from the Torah, so then he's chayev, then he's obligated. Levitel mixas or lakiyam mixas, but let's say he's just nullifying part of it. So Rabbi Shimon Omer pater, Rabbi Shimon says if it's just part of it, then he's pater. Uva avodas kochavim, now by avodah zara. Afilu amar hayom ovdo lemachar bitl, even if he says today you should worship the avodah zara, but tomorrow you should nullify. So since it's avodah zara, so chayev, we're going to say that he's chayev. And the implication of the brisa clearly is that hayom ulamachar would be like bitl mixas mixas and kiyum mixas, because the whole point is that by bittul mixas and kiyum mixas, Rabbi Shimon says potter. But by avodah zara, by bittul mitzvahs and kiyum mixas, he would say chayiv, and apparently hayom ulamachar is considered bittul mixas and kiyum mixas. Shma mina, so you see from there, ein Shabbos b'shvius. If they say the mistaken ruling is there's no Shabbos in the Shemitah year, kibittul mixas v'kiyum mixas dami, that would be similar to just being mevatel, part of the idea of Shabbos. And the Gemara says shma mina, indeed we do see that this is the case. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, Horu Bezdin. Let's say the Bezdin issues a ruling, again the Sanhedrin issues a ruling. V'yada echon mehen shato, and one of them knows, one of the judges knows that they made a mistake. V'amar lohen toin atem, and he says to them, you're making a mistake. O shalohaya mufla shal Bezdin sham, or let's say the expert of the court is not present there at the time. O shaya echon mehen ger o mamzer o nesin o zakin, or let's say one of the members of the court is a ger, a convert, or a mamzer, or a nesin, or a zakin shalo roy lebanim, an elder who's not able to have children. Hareza potter. In all of these cases, we would say that they're exempt. It would not be considered a ruling in terms of the halacha of par helam davar shel tzibur. Shenemar kan eda, v'nemar lahalon eda, because it says over here the word eda, and it says further on the word eda. Ma edo hamura lahalon, just like when it says eda further on, kulon ru'uyin lahora, the point is everybody on the court needs to be fit to issue the ruling. Af edo hamura kan, so too when it says eda over here, ad sheyu kulon ru'uyin lahora, they all have to be fit to issue the ruling. And Rashi explains, V'amar lahem toim atem. Let's say one of them says that you're making a mistake. Lo have a hora malya. So in that case, it's not considered a real ruling. Upater, and therefore we're going to say exempt in that case. Deba'inon ad sheyoru kulan. Rashi says because we need it to be a unanimous ruling. Kedamar le'el, like we said earlier. Now the commentaries do ask on this Rashi that what we said earlier was not necessarily accepted. That was a statement of an Amora that it needs to be unanimous. But the Gemara ultimately went on to challenge that idea. So it is difficult to understand how Rashi is interpreting that the Mishnah is in line with that ruling. That's discussed by the commentaries. Another case that the Mishnah has over here is, let's say, the expert of the court is not present there. Even though he's not from the Sanhedrin itself. Now, if he was from the Sanhedrin, even if the smallest judge from among them was not there, that would not be considered a ruling. Adas Isa Lakula Sanhedrin have a hora. We're going to learn from the pasuk. You have to have the whole Sanhedrin there for it to be a hora. V'lo lo, and if not, not. And you could say, let's say one of them needs to go on the road. You appoint someone else. Inami zakin she'in lo bonim haya lekach nismana achar b'Sanhedrin. Or there was an elder who did not have children, and that's why someone else was appointed to the Sanhedrin. And the point over here is that these are ways in which you can have the expert of the court not actually part of the Sanhedrin, and he's not present. O zakin she'in roy lebanim, or let's say you have an elderly person who can't have children. On this Rashi says v'kasha li mimnei ma'in roy lahora. I don't understand exactly why this individual is not able to issue a ruling, but that is an assumption of the Mishnah. V'namar lahalan eda. In any case, we learn all of this out from the word eda, because it says eda over here, and it says further on eda. It says v'shaftu eda v'yitzilu eda. That's talking about capital punishment, the Hainu Sanhedrin, and there the word eda refers to the Sanhedrin. And the idea again is, just like over there, we're talking about the eda that is all of them are ru'uyin lahura, all of them are fit to issue the ruling. That has to be true over here as well, in order for it to be considered a ruling in terms of par helam davar shel tzibur. And the Gemara says, "O shalohaya mufla shel bezdin sham." Again, the Mishnah said if the expert of the court is not present over there, so that would also be a problem. And on that, the Gemara says, "Minolan." From where do we know that that is problematic? Amar Rav Sheshes v'chein tana devei Rabbi Yishmael. Rav Sheshes says, and was also taught in the yeshiva of Rabbi Yishmael, "Mipnei ma amru horu b'davar shahat tzedukin modin bo p'tur." And what's the reason if they issue a mistaken ruling in something that's obvious that even the tzedukin admit to that they're exempt? Mipnei shahaya lehem lilmod v'lo lamdu. Ultimately, the reason is because that's something they should have learned, and they should have learned and they did not learn it. It's almost like a ruling that is wrong on purpose. And so therefore, the same applies over here. Lo haya mufla shel bezdin sham. If the expert of the court is not there, nami patur, and they're also patur. If they had an expert that they could have consulted and they didn't consult, that's something as if they should have learned it and they didn't learn it. And so therefore also that's considered to be on purpose already, and it would not be included as a mistaken ruling in terms of the halacha of par helam davar shel tzibur. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Nemar Sham Eida v'Nemar Kan Eida Ashu Kulan Ru'uyan Lahora. Just like over there by capital punishment, they all have to be fit to issue the ruling. The same is true over here as well. And the Gemara asks, V'hasam Minolan, over there, how do we know that it's true? Where do we know the source that over there they all have to be fit for issuing the ruling? The Amar Rav Chisda Amar Kra, because Rav Chisda said that the pasuk says, V'siyatzvu sham imach, it says they're going to stand with you, that's with Moshe Rabbeinu, imach bedomin lach, it means with you, similar to you. So therefore, they all have to be fit to issue the ruling. The Gemara says, imach l'shchina, but maybe imach means for the shchina. We'll see Rashi in a moment what that means. El Amar of Nachman Bar Yitzchak, rather, of Nachman Bar Yitzchak says, Amar Krutz, because the pasuk says, v'nasu itach, they're going to carry the burden with you. Itcha bedomin l'cha, again, they have to be similar to you. And Rashi explains, V'hasam enolon tekulu dehavin ru'uyin lahora. How do we know that they all have to be fit lahora? They all have to be fit to issue the ruling. You can't have among them a ger, a mamzer, etc. Amar of Chisda says, Gamar mi Moshe. It's learned from Moshe. To Moshe uki Sanhedrin. When Moshe set up the Sanhedrin, dahavin kulon ru'uyin lahora. They all have to be fit to issue a ruling. Dechsiv v'siyatzvu sham imach bedomin lach. Similar to you, to have a kulon ru'uyin lahora. They have to be fit to issue a ruling like you. Hachanami bo'inon de Sanhedrin di alma. Lahavi ru'uyin lahora. Again, the Sanhedrin has to be fit. All of them have to be fit. V'ho'elu matzino de'edo hamurakan kulan ru'uyin. Since we find that the edo over here, they're all fit, so lahora to issue the ruling. Shamina minonami dehainu Sanhedrin gedola. The same is true by the great Sanhedrin. The Tanya b'toras kvanim adas Yisrael eda hamiyuchedes l'chol Yisrael ve'ezu zu Sanhedrin gedola. The eda, again, it refers to the great Sanhedrin. Ve'imo imach mishum shchina. Now the Gemara then challenged it and said maybe imach really is because of the shchina. Rashi will have two explanations here. The lagufe hudasa, meaning it's to teach in this context over here. Kalomar shiu omdin imach, they have to stand with you. V'lo yikansu lefnai v'lefnim b'makom shchina. Maybe it simply means that they can't enter the area of the shchina lefnai v'lefnim. T'salka daita amina v'hoel the cause of esvali the yikansu b'makom shchina. Maybe I would have thought that esvali gathered to me these elders. It means they should gather in the place where the shchina is. Kamash malon. Maybe that's what it means. Imach. They should be with you. They should not be in the place of the shchina. Lishna Achrin, another explanation what the Gemara is challenging. Imach mishum shchina means because of the shchina. Kolomar borer tzadikim gemurim. You have to pick people who are full tzadikim. Shani rotza lahashro shchina aleim, because I want to have the shchina upon them. But that would be again only because of the shchina. Would not apply to future Sanhedrins. And the Gemara then answered, Itach bedomin lach shiu ru'uyin lahora. Again, they have to be fit to issue the ruling. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, Horu Bezdin Shogegin. Let's say the Bezdin, the Sanhedrin, issues a mistaken ruling. V'yasu Kol HaKol Shogegin, and then the entire community, they based on that Shogeg, they follow that ruling. That's the case of Par Helam Davar Shal Tzibor, Mevi and Par, they would bring the Par. And the Mishnah continues, Mezidin, if the Bezdin, the wrong ruling was issued on purpose, v'yasu shogegin, and then everybody did it by mistake, so that's already like an individual shogeg, mevi and kisbu sira, then they bring the female sheep or the female goat. That is not a case of par helam davar shal tzibor, rather it's treated like an individual chatos. And finally, shogegin v'asu mezidin, let's say the ruling was issued by mistake, but what was done on purpose, hareelu peturin, so in that case, they're exempt, the carbon is not brought when the action was done b'mezid. And the Gemara says, Shogegin v'yasu mezidin harelu petur. And the end of the Mishnah said that if it's a situation where the ruling of the Sanhedrin was a mistaken ruling, it was b'shogeg, but the people acted b'mezid, so then they are exempt from bringing the par helam davar shal tzibor. And so the Gemara draws an inference from this line. Hashogeg dumya b'mezid. Let's say it would be a case where it wouldn't be that it was done b'mezid, but it was done b'shogeg, it was done by mistake similar to mezid. So apparently chayiv, in that case, there would be liability. Vehechi dami. And the Gemara says, what would be an example of shogeg dumya demezid? The case could be as follows: Shahoru bezdin shechelev mutter. Let's say the bezdin issued a mistaken ruling that chelev is permitted. V'nischalif lo b'shuman. And then what happened was the person got mixed up between shuman and chelev. V'yachlo, and he ate the chelev thinking that it was shuman. And so that could be a case where what he was doing actually is shogeg dumya demezid, meaning to say, had he known this was chelev, he still would have eaten it based on the mistaken ruling of the court. It just happens to be in this case, he ate it because he thought that it was shuman and didn't even realize that it was chaylev. Now, if that is the case, leima tifshot had the boy Rami Bar Chama. If that's the case, we can say that this answers the question of Rami Bar Chama. This was exactly the question that Rami Bar Chama had earlier in the Mesechet, that if you have a situation where the person mixed up chaylev and shuman, and he ate the chaylev thinking that it was shuman, so in that situation, one could say that that is a true shogeg where the person is obligated to bring a carbon, or one could argue that the person would have eaten it anyway, even if he knew it was chaylev, because he would have done that based on the mistaken ruling of the court. So we should say that this answers that question. And the Gemara continues and says, Amar Loch, Rami Bar Chama will say to you, you cannot infer anything from our Mishnah. Mishum detana reisha mezidin v'yasu shogegin. Since the beginning of the Mishnah had a case of mezidin, where the ruling was issued wrongfully on purpose, and then asu shogegin, the people acted by mistake, that was the phrase mezidin v'yasu shogegin, tana seifa shogegin v'asu mezidin. That's why at the end of the Mishnah, it uses the expression shogegin v'yasu mezidin, but it's not to infer anything about shogeg dumya demezid. It's just using an expression that is in contrast with the expression at the beginning of the Mishnah. There is a slight machlokus between Rashi and the Tosa Rosh we'll see over here in terms of exactly how to understand this Gemara. First, we'll take a look at Rashi. Rashi says, Taima de shogegin v'asu mezidin peturin. De peturin. The reason why they're patur at the end of the Mishnah is because they acted b'mezid. And Rashi says, de mezid lav bar karbanu. Because if somebody does something b'mezid, you don't bring a carbon for that. Lo tzibur v'lo yachid. It doesn't matter if it's a community or an individual, there's no carbon for mezid. And then we can infer, Hashogeg dumya demezid. Let's say it would be a mistake similar to b'mezid, meaning to lo have a mamish tola bebezin, meaning he wasn't completely dependent on the court when he did what he did. So have a shogeg tola biatzmo. That would be a situation where the shogeg is a real mistake that he himself made, v'chayev, and he'd actually be obligated to bring a carbon. B'shigegas ma'isa karinabe. That would be considered a genuine shogeg. Kagon shahoru bezin shechela mutter. For example, let's say bezin issued a ruling, a mistaken ruling of the chelev is permitted. Rashi notes shal hakerev v'lo shal hakloyos to lo aveoker kol haguf. It can't be that the bezin ruled that chelev is entirely mutter, because it can't be where they're uprooting the whole idea of chelev. That we already said you can't uproot an entire concept. So let's say they just said the chelev on the kerev is mutter, not on the kloyos, so they uprooted part of it. Again, that would be the case. But the point is v'neschalef chelev b'shuman v'yachlo. Then what happened is the person mixed up chelev with shuman and he ate it. So the way Rashi understands is to chayiv. So apparently in that case, we would say that that's called a shogeg and he's chayiv. To tola biatzmo, because that would be considered a mistake that he is making. That would not be considered tola bebezdin, meaning to say this is karov lemezid. It's kind of like a mezid in the sense that he is sort of relying on bezdin because he would have done it anyway, even had he not mixed up the chaylev and the shuman. But in this case, we don't say that. We say it's not considered bemezid. It's shogeg that's karov lemezid, and we consider the shogeg Karav Lemezid, we say that that's considered a shogeg. The reason why we're saying that's a shogeg, not Karav Lemezid, but Dumya Demezid, same idea. The reason why we're saying it's similar to Mezid is Mishum Dechihechi Demezid Lav Tola Bebezinu, just like someone who does something on purpose isn't relying on the court. Hai Shogeg Nami Lav Tola Bebezinu. This guy who's Beshogeg also, he is not relying on the court. V'tiv Shod Ha Deboy Rami Bar Chama. We should answer the question of Rami Bar Chama. The way that Rashi is understanding it is the answer that we would be inferring is that in this type of situation of shogeg dumya demezid, it actually would be considered a genuine shogeg, and since it would be considered to be a genuine shogeg, he'd be chayiv to bring a carbon. And Rashi continues, Amar lach Rami Bar Chama will say to you, Haida katani shogegin v'asu mezidim. When the end of the Mishnah uses the phrase shogegin v'asu mezidim, lav lemeidak mina. It's not to infer ka'asi. It's not to infer that again, if it would be shogeg dumya demezid, that would be different. Ela aidi detana mezidin v'asu shogegin. Since the beginning of the Mishnah uses the expression of mezidin v'asu shogin, tananami shogin v'asu mezidin. So therefore, we also learn shogegin v'asu mezidin uchdei nas. But it's just the way of the language of the Mishnah to do that. V'lo daikinan mina klum. You shouldn't be making any inferences. Uboy didei meha leko lemishma mina. And therefore, you cannot answer the question of Rami Bar Chama from here. And we will take a look at the Tosas Harash as well. And the Tosas Harash focuses in on the fact that really the Mishnah over here is not talking about an individual committing the Avera and bringing a personal individual carbon chatas. The Mishnah is really talking about the Par Helam Davar Shal Tzibor. And it's saying that if the entire community does it b'mezid, so then they're not going to bring the Par Helam Davar Shal Tzibor. And so the inference is as follows. Hashogegin dumya demezid. And let's say the entire community would be shogegin similar to mezid. Could go in shahoru bezdin shachelev mutter. Let's say, for example, the Bezin would issue a ruling that in a mistaken ruling that chaylev is mutter, v'neschalef l'tzibor chaylev b'shuman, and then the community mixes up chaylev and shuman, v'achalu, and then they eat it. V'ahi dumya demezid. Now that would be similar to a mezid. That's called shogeg dumya demezid to lo talu b'bezin, because they weren't doing it based on the court. They were doing it because they mixed up the chaylev and the shuman. Dinami loho rubezin. Now even if the Bezin wouldn't have issued the ruling, havi achli le, they would have eaten it because again they mixed up the chaylev and shuman. But chayovin lohav lahavi par helim. So you're going to infer that in this situation, since it's not a true Mesed, it's shogeg dumya de Mesed, they would have to bring the par helim davar shel tzibor. Ki ilu yadi shahaya chaylev, it's the exact same thing as if they knew it was chaylev. V'achalu b'horas bezdin, and the entire community did that based on the ruling of the bezdin. So that's the inference that we're making in the case of the communal sin, that they would have to bring the par. V'tivshod boy Rami bar Chama. Now, if you take it in that direction, we can then answer the question of Rami bar Chama. Just like with regards to the community, it's called a hora. That case would be called a ruling, and they would bring a par. Even if the bezin had not ruled, again, they would have eaten it anyway, but still they bring the par. The same is going to be true by an individual. Mikri tola bebezin. This would be a situation where it's considered really the yachid is acting based on the courts. In a case of the yachid, it's the exact opposite. Upater, he'd actually be exempt. The way the Tosa Rosh learns, unlike Rashi, is that the answer to the question that the Gemara is saying that we're answering Rami bar Chama's question, the answer actually would be that the individual would be exempt. The reason why the individual would be exempt is because what's happening over here? The individual is eating the chaylev thinking that it's shuman, but really it's considered to be tola bebezin. He would have eaten it even if he knew it was chaylev, because he was relying on the court, and therefore that would be a situation of tola bebezdin. By tola bebezdin, by a yachid, he actually doesn't have to bring an individual chatas. We say since he was relying on the court, he doesn't have to bring a chatas. It's only if he makes a mistake that wasn't relying on the court that he brings a chatas. Now it happens to be that by the par helam davar shel tzibor, the fact that the community relies on the court is exactly the reason you do bring the par helam davar shel tzibor. And so the difference really between the way Rashi learns and the way the Rosh learns is the way that the Rosh learns. The Rosh is understanding that the answer that the Gemara is assuming this is an answer to the question of Rami bar Chama, the answer is that this is considered tola bebezdin, and therefore since this is still considered tola bebezdin, even though the person mixed up the chaylev and the shuman, therefore it would be a situation where he's potter from bringing the carbon. That's what the Gemara thought to infer. The Gemara said again, you can't make any inference from the Mishnah. The way Rashi understands, we're just inferring that this is considered a shogeg. In a case of Mesed, you never bring a carbon because it's b'mezid. There's no such thing as a carbon by Mesed, whether it's a tzibur or a yachid. We then infer that if it was shogeg dumya de Mesed, so then that would not be considered Mesed, that would be shogeg, and therefore we're simply inferring that by the yachid he actually would bring the carbon chatas in a case of shogeg dumya de Mesed. That was what would have been the answer to the question, and again the Gemara then says you can't make any inference from the Mishnah, so you cannot answer the question. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, Horu bezdin v'yasu kol hakol. Let's say the bezdin issues a ruling, and the entire congregation acts according to the mistaken ruling. O Ruban, or the majority of the congregation, Alpian, they act based on the mistaken ruling of the court. Mevian par, so then they bring a par, that's the par helam davar shel tzibor. Uvavodas kochavim, now if the mistaken ruling involved avodah zara, mevian par v'sar, so then they bring a par and a sar. Divrei Rabbi Meir, these are the words of Rabbi Meir, and the idea according to Rabbi Meir is that it's the bezdin that brings the par. Rabbi Yehuda says Yud Beis Shvatim Mevian Yud Beis Parim. What actually happens is the 12 Shvatim, each of them bring a par, so there's a total of 12 parim. Uvavodas kochavim, and by avodah zara Mevian Yud Beis Parim Mushnei Asar Seirim. They bring 12 parim and 12 seirim. And Rashi explains, Horu bezdin v'yasu kol hakol, Ruban alpein mevian par, bezdin v'lo tzibor. Again, according to Rabbi Meir, it's the bezdin that brings the par. V'avodas kochavim bezdin mevian par v'soyer. Divrei Rabbi Meir, when it comes to avodah zara, the bezdin brings a par and a soyer. V'avodas kochavim b'hora. If you have a situation of avodah zara by a mistaken ruling, par v'soyer maisi. There, the halacha is that you bring both a par and a soyer. Techsib b'parsha shlach l'chol anashim v'chisishku v'lo sasu. As kol mitzvos ha'ela talks about all the mitzvahs, dahainu ba'avodas kochavim. That's a reference to avodah zara. Kidamar l'kamon v'perak horakoin Mashiach, like we're going to say later. Ezuhi mitzvah sheshkula keneged kol ha'mitzvahs ha'aviyomar za'avodas kochavim. What mitzvah is equivalent of all mitzvahs? That's avodah zara. Uchsiv, and it's written, v'asu kol oida par ben bakar echad liol. It says you're going to bring a par ben bakar, one for an ola l'reich nichoach la'Hashem, u'mincha so v'nisko kamishpat usir izim echad l'chatas. So you're bringing a par as an ola, and you're bringing a sir izim as a chatas. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Yud Beis Shvatim Mevian Yud Beis Parim. Rabbi Yehuda says the 12 Shvatim bring 12 Parim. The Chol Shevet v'Shevet Ikri Kol, because every Shevet is called a Kol. The Kosavar Tzibor Mevian Par, and Rabbi Yehuda holds that it's the community that brings the Par, so it's like 12 communities. V'lo Bezin, it's the Tzibor that brings the Par, and not the court. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Hey Amud Aleph.